This portion of the CU podcast is sponsored by Andy VHB, your destination for video game pickup and collection videos, gameplay videos, weekly fantasy football coverage, and lottery scratch-off videos. There's even giveaways. Head on over and check out youtube.com/AndyVHB.
Do you think when GameStop got out of retro gaming, well, I guess they mean 12 years ago, they're back in it now, that created the current retro market and small shops?
It certainly created the boom because there was a gaping hole left. And I think more Funko than GameStop, because I seem to remember GameStop getting out of it quicker than Funko.
Well, they bought Funko and shuttered it.
Well, sure, but what I'm saying is Funko existed after GameStop stopped selling, say, NES cartridges. And then GameStop bought them out. I know this because GameStop stopped selling NES cartridges in Buffalo, New York, but I could still drive down to Erie, PA and buy cheap NES games from Funko for a little while longer.
Well, at least in New Jersey, they consolidated them all into only 3 shops in the state. They took all the retro games, took them. This is after, I think, GameStop bought them. They consolidated them all into a few Funko Lands in the state. You had to go there and find them.
This is just my experience because in Western New York, there were no Funko Lands. I had to drive to Pennsylvania.
Let me see when they bought them.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely created the boom. There was a hole to fill. However, there were still small video game shops in, Buffalo, New York. Mom and pop shops for everything, I think, have always existed. But yeah, people didn't always want to wait till the weekends to go to flea markets. Flea markets weren't always as cutthroat, but there were always people who were into these things. And at the time, smaller market meant less of these booths, so you still kind of had a level of competition. Now, obviously, it wasn't as high as it is today, not by any stretch of the imagination, but you still kind of had to do a little bit of a hustle and keep your eye out for the good stuff. So, yes. And also, it was when places like GameStop, got out of retro, and when places like Funko Land ceased to exist, that's when I think the places like Luna that have been around for as long as they have got into the market and have been able to create stability in their business, because that's when it was easiest to start buying stock, because it was cheaper then. Or at least it was easier to get your business going then, because it was easier to create that stock. It was easier to buy these things. It was cheap. Your markup didn't have to be insane to make a profit. Now, and I've discussed this before, to buy your stock and then to mark it up to make a profit, you would really have to be, I think, look, I don't disagree with anyone who's upset by prices they see at a lot of these stores. It's ridiculous what they're charging. But you have to understand, to a degree, these are people who are opening shops in the modern era, maybe places that have only been around for 2 or 3 years, and they're buying their stuff at basically retail or just under retail, and for them to keep those lights on, they have to charge these insane prices. Now, maybe that's just you can say easily that they made a bad business choice by trying to open a retro shop in the modern era, but that is, if you just take 2 seconds to think about it, that's why their prices are so high. A place that's charging a more reasonable price for these games is because they got into it early enough, had their initial stock, got their business going for a cheaper price, and now they've got their trade-ins coming in. They're paying fair for trade-ins. They've got their market value. So that was the time, more so than anything, that was the time to get your business going. So yes, that was the era when
2004.
This was the era, Luna opened in 2003. So 2003, 2004, this was the era when the people who saw the market, who were into the games and saw a hole to fill, this was when they were like, that was the ace time to start. It was probably lean for a couple of years. It was probably, it
was lean, but it was cheap to get all the stock.
Right, exactly. But, to hear, the early days of Luna, it was a lot of Treg working by himself, and it was, the first couple of years, there wasn't a lot of profit. There wasn't a lot of loss, but there wasn't a lot of profit. But then as time went on, profit rose substantially as the market for it grew. But that was how you did it.
Sure. So here's the history lesson. So Barnes & Noble buys Babbage's in 99. They then buy Funko. in May of 2000. So at that point, it no longer exists by itself. So those Funkolands you saw were then under control of Barnes & Noble. And then Barnes & Noble then takes GameStop public in February 2002. So at that point, Funkoland basically ceased to exist as its own entity in the year 2000. So going back to that, I think what Ian touched upon was, so at that point, Funkoland was a big one, and whatever else was around there. My Software Etc., I do not remember if my Software Etc. and Electronic Boutiques had used game sales. I think the Software Etc. might have had a little bit in the early 2000s, but I'm not positive. Like if it was like literally like a bin this big though, of like some, like they had a Super Mario Duck Hunt. I remember we're talking early 2000s when I really started getting heavier into collecting. But yeah, I went to Funkoland in 2000. We'll say 2003, 2004. They started that's when they basically started getting rid of all their retro stock, which was everything, from up to the 64 era, or I think it was up to the 16-bit era. I think the 64 stuff they still were stocking, I believe, but I'm not positive. 12 years ago. But at the time, though, I was going to other stores, though, in other shops. There was a place along Route 18 Flea Market, which I don't think is there anymore. There was a guy inside selling retro games. Down the road, there was a little shop that had retro games. There was one on Route 1, a guy who had retro games. So they did exist here and there. But after that, I'm having a hard time thinking of them. I think a lot of them were, let's see, there was one on Route 22 in Scotch Plains that did music, and then they might have still done video games or stopped doing video games in the early 2000s. So yeah, but I think it took them a little while to get going though. But yeah, once you hit the middle of 2000, the first whatever, the aughts, the fuck is it gonna? Can we settle on a fucking term for a decade that's 6 years past? Midway through the aughts, I think you started to see, at least in New Jersey, and then by that point, I think Digital Press was very well established, which is one of the best stores I've ever been to in New Jersey. But that was still the golden age of flea markets and getting 40 NES games for $20, like the garbage bag of games. That was still the era. So there wasn't the need as much, I think, of now to go to a retro game shop 12 years ago, because this stuff was still cheap everywhere. You can go on eBay and buy anything you wanted for cheap, or go to a flea market and strike it big more often than not. So really only, I think, the past 5-6 years when the need for that shop to go for a regular supply really came to at least to get a deal, or to find something maybe you don't want to outbid 80 other people on eBay for,